Well, we're going to be working on aging in society, the second half of this chapter this week. And the first question that is asked is, when is old? Well, you may think that's a silly question because isn't it obvious when old is old? Well, it's really not. It depends on the culture, it depends on who you ask. And the point being that, like every other practically institution and concept in society, it depends. It's a social construction of when you are old, depending very much on the society that you are in. So, for example, here are some examples of that. In the past, African countries, many African countries, and many people had such a short life expectancy because of disease and civil wars and nutritional issues, all of that. That 40 was old. People just didn't live much past 50. Well, if you don't live much past 50, then 40 is old. Now, I want to remind you something. When we're talking about life expectancy and age at which people die, it's taking all different ages and creating an average in a sense. So it a lot of the people that don't live to 70 or 80 died when they were really young as well. But in general, this tells us what the average age of death or life expectancy in a particular culture is. Now, so 40 was old because most, life expectancy was around 50 in some of those African countries. But industrialized nations, the average life expectancy now is almost 79. And so 40 is young, right? You have half your life left as opposed to 10 years left in those African countries. So can you see how the social construction of reality, the social construction of age, it all depends on where you are in the world, geographically, what your society and culture is like. So in the US, people are old at 65, 66, 67, simply based on the fact that at that point they can retire and get Social Security and Medicare. So that's kind of our line of dividing line now. And that's not because of anything chronological, it's because of social programs and how we define people who are eligible for them. Okay. So some at those ages, 65, 66, 67, are still extremely vigorous and productive, whereas others have, severe mental and physical limitations. So how can you say someone who's perfectly vigorous, still working full time, et cetera, is old at 65, and someone else is indeed old at 65 in terms of how their body and brain is manifesting? You get the point, I'm sure. So there's very significant differences between these categories. The young old, which is 65 to 74, the old, which is 75 to 84, and the oldest old, which is 84 and older. Those significant differences break down through research. That's how those the years came up with, the ages came up with, in their ability to live independently, to work, and in terms of health. So let's look at life expectancy. The average expected number of years of life remaining in a given age, okay, at a given age. So American children born in 2010 are expected to live to be almost 80, 79 years old. And that was 71 in 1970, and you go back to 1900 and it was 47. All those infectious diseases in the 1900s, before there were, a variety of medicines and vaccines and things of that nature. That doesn't mean that people died at 47 in 1900. It was the average life expectancy. There were some very old people but not nearly the percentage of old people that there are today, for instance. And as you might imagine, life expectancy varies really widely and greatly by sex, social class, and race and ethnicity. I'm sure you're used to this by now, because virtually everything we've studied, race, and a variety of other things, are based on those criteria: sex, social class, race, and ethnicity. So let's look at sex first. Across, you probably know this, across all different those different age categories of young, old, 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 and old, oldest, women live the longest. Okay, they live longer than men, and interestingly, Latinas have the longest lifespan. So why do women live longer than men? There's been so much research done on this, and there's many different answers, of course, not just one. There are genetic differences, etc. But here's the social external forces. Men have higher rates of smoking, heavy drinking, gun use, employment in hazardous occupations, and risk-taking behaviors in recreation and driving. So those are the social causes of men's much lower life expectancy levels. They're not much, but lower life expectancy levels than women. Now, the gender gap in life expectancy has actually narrowed since the 1990s because women had started smoking more, and women have now, because of work-home stresses, have stress issues. Work-home life issues have stress. Stress is not good for life expectancy. What about social class? As you might expect, the higher the socioeconomic levels, the longer life expectancy is. So people with college degrees and higher are more likely to be employed. They're more likely to be financially secure, and therefore they're more likely to have access to good health care. They're also more likely to exercise, not to smoke or drink alcohol to excess, and maintain a healthy body weight. So, and that also has to do with education and also peer pressure to a great extent in higher social classes. So an exception to that, though, to all of those categories that we just talked about in higher social class, is Latinos, who have among the lowest education levels, but the highest life expectancy rates. So they're a dichotomy here. There's something that's different. And researchers think that possibly only the healthiest migrate. That could be one reason, that when Latinos become sick, they return to family and home country, family of origin, when their health deteriorates. Recent immigrants compared to whites are less likely to smoke and have strong networks during illness. So it's not only that only the healthiest ones might migrate to the U.S., and if they become extremely ill, go home. It's also lifestyle issues of smoking less and having strong networks when you're ill is very important in terms of getting well. So life expectancy has declined in the U.S. in the last several years. And I'm going to put an article up in the coursework about why that has occurred, but it's of great concern. It's declined the last 3 years at least, the life expectancy, down, down, down. And so there is great concern about that in the United States. It has to do with diet, the increase in diabetes and heart disease, stress, all kinds of things. So we're going to look now at how the aging population in America is changing. So the number of people 65 years and older is increasing in America, in the US, and they're becoming more ethnically and racially diverse. This is part of the reason for the increase is the baby boomer population, which we'll look at in a few moments. So more than 16.5% of the population is over 65. That's up from 14% in like 2012. There's a dramatic increase from only 4% in 1900. We're over 65. And it's going to be more than 20% over 65 in 1930 by 2030, excuse me. So we're at like 16.5% now. In another 9 years, it's going to be 20% over 65. That's a graying, aging population. So and interestingly, one of the very fastest growing groups is the oldest old. So the 85 and over population is projected to more than double from 6.4 million in 2016 to 14.6 million in 2040. That's 129% increase. Isn't that amazing? So here's three important implications. Why does this matter? Well, it's going to matter to you young people, and here's why, okay? So healthcare and caregiving needs and services costs will surge. Now, on the upside, for those of you who are going into healthcare professions, so will the need for people in those professions, okay? But the costs are going to increase. 2, the number of old Americans is increasing while more adult children, even in their 60s, even adult children in their 60s, if the 85 and older is the fastest growing aging population, you could be taking care of your parents when you're getting old, right? That's what this implies. Be caring for aging parents, grandparents, and other old relatives, many more than in the past. And the disability rate recently increased dramatically among baby boomers. 1946 to 1964 was the baby boom generation, right after the war when the soldiers came home, 1946, and then up through 1964 is the baby boom generation. So disability is increasing due to our declining health, due to lifestyle issues, our diets, our lack of exercise, our high stress levels, smoking, drinking, etc. And so these people are going to be taking care of old parents while having more health problems themselves, like diabetes and obesity, high blood pressure, those kinds of things. The third problem or issue with this increasingly aging population in America is what's called the old age dependency ratio. That's the number of people age 65 and older who are no longer in the labor force relative to the number of working age adults 18 to 24. Why does that matter? Because it's the working adults who pay taxes for the programs that support the elderly, like Social Security and Medicare, for example. So it's a burden on the working age people to support the elderly people. That ratio, that old age dependency ratio, has risen. So in 2020, there has been only 3 working age people to be supporting each older person, compared to 14 working age people supporting an elderly person in 1900. Now remember, there were hardly any very elderly people in 1900s, so there could be 14 people. So what that means is that younger people today are going to have to pay more in taxes, right? Federal and state taxes, to pay for the programs that support this increasing bubble of elderly people. So here's some current aging issues. The sandwich generation. What the sandwich generation means, it's midlife men and women who are caring for older parents and their children. Not the older parents' children, their own children. So you've got you've got a generation above you you're taking care of and a generation below you. with your own children that you're taking care of. And you also might be supporting a grown child. That can happen as well. So about 71% of people in that sandwich generation, and this is a growing trend in America, are 40 to 59, ages 40 to 59. It causes a lot of stress because, you know, you're caring for an old generation and a young generation at the same time, and you're still working, right? You're trying to work. You're trying to live on your income. You know, it used to be, whew, the kids are gone. You know, now I can kind of relax, have more money, et cetera, et cetera. But that doesn't happen if your adult children or older children are still dependent on you somewhat financially. And now you're taking care of your mom and dad as well. So it causes a lot of stress for the people in the sandwich generation, because older people need assistance, as I just said, at the same time as children, and grandchildren's lives are complicated and demanding and expensive. So there's three specific outcomes that the sandwich generation is experiencing and will experience in the future. There's going to be more multi-generational households, because the only way to do this is for everybody to live together and pay one rent, right? Rather than you're helping your adult kids pay their rent, or the 18-year-old, you're helping grandma pay her rent. No, that doesn't work. So the percentage is going to continue to rise dramatically in multi-generational households. Currently, 28% of Asians are more likely to live in generational households, 26% of African Americans, 25% of Latinos, and 14% whites. And the reasons for that, as I just said, are money, primarily, poverty. Also, increasingly, there's another trend of grandchildren living with grandparents due to drugs and alcohol. And you know, a really good thing about it is there's intergenerational support as well there with a group of people living together. But the effects are mixed because, you know, the positive side of it is that the elder people living with you in your multi-generational household may help provide financial support. They can kick in part of their Social Security or their savings or something. But there also could be a lot of conflict and, you know, powerful emotional and resentment and abuse and a variety of other things that can come out of the stress levels of that situation. We're not a culture, generally, white Americans, Euro Americans, that have intergenerational households. We have nuclear families, is the way we were raised and the way we think families should be, you know, so it can create a lot of stress. What about the right to die issue? You know, Oregon was a pioneer in this, as I'm sure you know. So it's one of the most controversial issues. You know, in the last year of life, this is so amazing to think about. That's 1/4 of all Medicare payments. You know, and you can't get Medicare till you get Social Security. So this is people over 65, 66, 67, depending on what year they were born. 1/4 of all of those payments are paid in the last year of life. And later we're going to see that that's the most expensive treatments as well, is that last year of life, those extreme medical interventions. Okay. So Oregon, as some of you probably know, was the first state to have the Death with Dignity Act. So if one is diagnosed to have a life expectancy of 6 months or less, then you're eligible for physician-assisted suicide. And so that there are other states now that have, I forget how many more, 7 or 8, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, like 10 states or approximately have Death with Dignity Acts out of 50. So in most states, you still cannot do that. Even though 70% of Americans agree that death with dignity is, you know, those kinds of acts, physician-assisted suicide, are good things, it's still not the majority of the country, illegal in most of the country. Now, this section is something interesting to think about. This is a conflict perspective. Competition for scarce resources. So what does this mean? There's a finite amount of money to go around, and healthcare facilities and a variety of other things, okay, which we're experiencing now with COVID, right? You know, it isn't an infinite amount of hospital beds available, et cetera, et cetera. So let's look at what this competition for scarce resources means. And it really is talking about how it affects generations below the elderly. So the 1930, when the Social Security Act went into effect in 1935, the life expectancy in America was just below 62 years. Okay, we know today it's almost 80 years. There's an additional 22 years then from when the law was enacted to now. The payments are made to support the elderly, okay? So what has occurred with this shift in demographics is that the government spends more on the elderly than it does on children. Now, this part is truly amazing. I want you to think about this, particularly, once again, those of you who are going, you know, maybe in the medical profession, I don't know. Medicare recipients who died in the year that one of the years they did the research on this. So medical recipients who died had 1/3 had surgery in the last year of their life. 1 in 5 had surgery in the last month of their life. And 1 in 10 had surgery in the last week of their life. Do you remember how 25% of Medicare funds were paid out in the last year of life? Can you begin to see why now? 60% of those surgeries in the last year of life of the research, and that was between a year, a month, and a week, and within that year, 60% of those people were 80 years old and older. And about 60% of cancer is diagnosed in men who are 65 and older. And this is kind of a mind-boggling figure. It costs $93,000 per patient to treat advanced prostate cancer. The treatment prolongs life about 4 months, according to your text. So what we have is huge amounts of money going to a for-profit medical system to maintain people's life, for, in the case of the 1 in 10, for a week of surgery that costs sometimes hundreds of thousands of dollars. Okay, so the Medicare funds are good till 2026. We got 5 more years of that, and you know, we'll see what Congress does and how things change. And Social Security is good through 2033, and then that's done, unless they do something about it, and hopefully they will. But it always depends on who's in control of Congress as to whether social needs are taken care of or not. So for you younger people, this is the fear among those of us who care, that what if those programs aren't there for you? We're back to pre-Depression days, right? We're back to dog eat dog, no help for the elderly and the poor, okay? Because Medicaid is part of that now as well too, which is for poor people, not just elderly people who get paid through those Medicare funds, okay? So despite rising healthcare costs, it's interesting, 20% of Americans say they want to live to the age of 100. So I don't think they're thinking it through all the way. And, you know, I guess if you want to live to the age of 100, I would say this is my personal aside, don't count on medicine to keep you going. Do what you need to do to stay healthy mentally and physically, as much as possible, of course. There's no guarantee, but you get my point. So what are the sociological explanations of family and aging? Well, the first is functionalism. They always start with that. The idea of functionalism is that families create stability and activity. So marriage, procreation, and procreation are critical for promoting social order and social cohesion. It's an institution, a primary institution of society. And parenthood provides a crucial social role of the socialization of children, which is essential to maintaining and transmitting and passing on culture. And what else does the family do? It provides, ideally, emotional support, financial support for many, many, many people, increasingly young adults who move back, we've talked about, young adults moving back home because they need further education to be competitive in, the job markets, et cetera, et cetera. So that's the functions of the family. And then there's activity theory, which has to do with the elderly. And the activity theory proposes that many elderly people remain engaged in their numerous roles and activities, and including work. They continue to work. I'm still working because I like it. And you have to learn new, even though these are things I've taught for years, you still have to learn new things and I had to learn new technology. There's a variety of things, so it keeps your mind sharp. And yes, particularly baby boom generation tends to want to keep working and be active mentally and physically. And it is true that those who keep active and keep learning, etc., tend to age better, have a better aging experience. They just adjust better to aging. So that's all. Once again, the don't worry, be happy, functionalist perspective, everything's good. Well, what's the critical evaluation? There's several weaknesses to this evaluation, which is, first of all, social scientists question whether family functions, we talked about this previously, are as, what's the word I'm trying to say, universal as functionalists claim, because families look differently and have different functions in other cultures. So it's not necessarily true that all those functions that I just listed that are so wonderful are universal. Second, and even with cultures that come to the United States, those may not be the functions of the family. Second, looking at activity theory, that sounds great if it's by choice that you keep active. But many people are working into their 80s. Think of Walmart greeters and things of that, who would give anything to be able to get off their feet and go home and just chill for the rest of their lives and do something they might enjoy doing but not working, but they can't afford to stop working. So not all people are in this wonderful activity theory place who are older and who are working. A lot of them have no choice and are kind of forced to continue working. And then the other aspect of this is that a critique of the functionalist perspective is that at least 10% of this huge wave of baby boomers says they're never going to retire. Okay. And that's because they haven't saved enough and carry too much debt. But what does that do to younger people? It locks up those jobs for longer that if people were able to retire would go away. So that's the critique of this functionalist perspective. Now, the conflict theory, and we already looked at the conflict theory a bit in the competition for scarce resources piece that we just discussed. So it's all about inequality, social class, and power. So, elderly people in wealthy families, don't worry, be happy, no problem, right? Because the families in high income brackets have the greatest share of capital wealth in the country, and they pass it down to the next generation. They can afford to care for the elderly in either at home with a variety of, round-the-clock caregivers, or in very expensive private settings, et cetera, et cetera. So that's great for people with a lot of money. But from the conflict perspective, economic inequality affects all aspects of family, including child abuse and neglect, which is highest among communities with the greatest poverty, and unequal accesses to resources in old age, as I just mentioned. So from the conflict perspective, being poor and having a lot of the wealth locked up in the top 1% to 10% means, once again, competition for scarce resources. There just isn't enough to go around. And, so that's a real problem in terms of both families with raising children, access to education and healthcare. Neither are universal in this country. Neither college education nor healthcare are universally acceptable. You got to cough up lots of money to do those things. So the people with the money are able to do those things. The people without are not. And those same inequalities spill over into old age as well as young families. The critical evaluation of the conflict theory is that what this level of analysis overlooks, that through paying taxes, rich people contribute. But the point, that's you can say that, but the problem is that they don't contribute nearly as much as they should, as tax rates have been reduced on the wealthy for many, 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 many years. So they could easily contribute much more than, plus they have great tax lawyers and loopholes, et cetera, et cetera. And the other criticism, they had to really dig to find criticisms here, is that conflict theorists link inequality to capitalism, which is true, but there's inequality in other non-capitalistic countries. Well, sure there is. Yeah, there's no question about that. The least inequality in any countries are the Scandinavian countries, for the most part, and a couple of others, and they are social democratic. They have a combination system, right, of capitalism, private enterprise, and government-funded things such as education and broadband and infrastructure and healthcare, those types of things, okay? Now, let's look at feminist theories, okay? And that looks at gender roles and patriarchy in relation to the families. So in most countries, there are patriarchal laws regarding inheritance and a variety of other things that oppress women, there's no equality. And in many countries, men control women's decisions about reproduction. Even in the United States, that happens with a predominantly male Congress and still predominantly male Supreme Court that makes laws about women's access to terminating pregnancies and a variety of other things. So there's male aggression against women and children. We're familiar with that. And of course, the fact that the poorest adults are likely to be females, because females live longer, okay? And out of 190 countries, only the United States, this is truly amazing, only United States, Papua New Guinea, and Swaziland in Africa don't have national paid parental leave. 3 countries out of 190 do not have national paid parental leave. One's New Guinea and one's in Africa. We're the third one, the richest country on earth. Okay. So the critical evaluation of that, once again, they have to kind of dig deep for this one, is that it overstates women's oppression. I don't think that, certainly globally, you cannot overstate women's oppression. So if we're talking about the United States, I still don't think they're overstating it. They're just stating facts. So Now, symbolic interactionism, remember, this has to do with meanings, values, beliefs, symbolic interaction. And what they're talking about is that how people create subjective meanings relating to family and old age so that we learn our roles in a family. We learn what we're supposed to be like when we get older and aging, that type of thing. So one of the ideas in symbolic interaction is called the exchange theory. And the exchange theory says, and it's about mate selection. How do we select our mates? Well, the exchange theory says that what we're doing, not consciously for the most part, although sometimes it is very conscious, but generally it's not, that we seek through our social interactions with one another, and particularly with potential mates, to maximize our rewards and minimize the costs of whatever that relationship is. Okay. We want to get as much as we can and give as little as we can. Not consciously, once again, this is a theory, the exchange theory. Okay. So in mate selection, what we're thinking about and doing is trading our resources, whatever they are, for better assets, for better or greater assets. Think about trophy wives in this context. Okay. Your assets may be that you're drop dead gorgeous and 30 years younger than this old duffer who isn't very attractive, but he's a millionaire or multimillionaire. What you gonna do? Well, it depends on you, right? And it depends on your socialization and your values and all of that stuff. But that is when I said some of them are more conscious than unconscious. Those are often conscious choices that, I mean, and the man's making the choice too. He knows damn well that if he weren't a multimillionaire, this gorgeous young thing would not pay the slightest bit of attention to him. So it works both ways. But can you see how it's maximizing the resources and trying to minimize the costs with certain things? So another example of that is that someone may stay, and that I've known many people like this. And it's very common that you stay in an unhappy marriage because there's some reward, cost ratio benefit there. That if you got divorced, you'd have to go live in a really cheap, crummy apartment in an awful neighborhood, and your kids wouldn't be able to go to good schools or whatever. So everybody kind of sticks it out. That's a cost benefit rate. That's the exchange theory. Another idea from the symbolic interactionist perspective is the idea of ageism. And there is a lot of discrimination against the elderly, some subtle, some not so subtle. There's unfortunately an enormous amount of violence against the elderly, both in nursing homes and in the home. So it can range from insulting jokes and disrespect to, actual violence. One of the things that drives me crazy, particularly, is what's called infantilization, where you turn somebody who's an elder into somebody who's kind of cute and funny. So when my hair turned white, people started in restaurants and things saying, "Hey, can I help you, sweetie?" Or "Thanks, sweetie." And I'm thinking, wait a minute, nobody ever called me that before. Or "dear." That's an example of infantilization. And that I see that in nursing homes all the time. I don't go to nursing homes that often, but I know at one point my grandmother was in one a long time ago, and she was always dear and sweetheart and darling, and something you'd call a child or a puppy maybe, or something, or someone whose marbles weren't all there. But it's extremely demeaning to not have respect for the elderly. So that is an example of ageism. Continuity theory is that for the aging is that you can find interesting and satisfactory new roles for yourself as you age. You retire as a teacher, but you become a painter, or you open a shop, or you make things to sell on Etsy, or, whatever the heck you do. That's called continuity theory. You don't just stop dead in your tracks or stay on the same old treadmill, that you have this opportunity to make a shift and do something else and develop new roles, often volunteering is something that people do. They do something they've always wanted to do, like volunteer in a literacy project and teach kids to read or something of that nature. So the critical evaluation of the symbolic interactions theory is that it's a micro level theory, which it is. It's not looking at the big picture like the structural issues like conflict theory does with inequality and competition for scarce resources. And it's not looking at the functions of an institution of society the way functionalism is. It's really looking at a smaller micro perspective of individual behavior or small groups behavior. And, that can be a criticism, but it's what the theory is about. And it's one of the three major theories of sociology. All right. See you next week.